You know, Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, a woman and her 2-year-old daughter are brutally murdered in their home. 36 years later, a man remains in prison for the crime that many are not convinced he committed. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my Geberus co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. Does that mean one who gabs a lot?
Who gabs? Sure, we'll go with that. You know, people give me these words, and usually I write down who it was, but sometimes I forget, and I'm not sure who gave me that word, and it doesn't appear to be a real word, at least based on my search of Google. So we're just going to say it is a word that is uniquely Alice. Alice is Geberus. So there you go.
Thanks. I appreciate it. And maybe it's just not in the English language. Google doesn't know everything. It knows a lot, but it doesn't know everything. But I'm very excited about this case because I am just reminded of other emails we need to respond to. We got to visit an awesome high school, Christ Presbyterian Academy in Tennessee, to discuss over the course of 2 days this case, because this school has ties to the case in lots of ways that you'll kind of know once we start delving into it. But it was such a treat to talk with these juniors and seniors who really blew me away. I couldn't believe their maturity level, their analytical skills. It felt like we were talking to peers, which might say something about our peers, but I think says a lot about these incredible students. They came with open minds, great research, and each day kind of the group grew. And obviously we're going to touch on some very sensitive topics whenever you have a potential innocence case, or at least a case where people have doubts about the guilt of the person serving time. Emotions can run high, but these students were really a class act in how to have respectful, analytical discussion, even when the topics at hand have real life implications.
In this school, they had some sort of Harry Potter thing going on. And so at various times, I guess randomly, they have school games. And when they have school games, like all the kids.
Like house games.
Yeah, house games. There you go. And you go down to the gym.
You don't live there kind of school. It's not a boarding school, though.
Right. But you go down to the gym and participate in these games for 30 minutes or something and earn points, or win points, I guess, for your house. And so in the middle of our talk, one of these house games was announced. And the kids all stayed. And we were like, we would have totally left.
And it was like a big deal. It was like, don't forget, the, championship comes down to X, Y, and Z, and something like you don't have to take exams or something. It was something big if you want. And we told everyone, like, it's okay. You guys are allowed to leave because this sounds like a big deal. This doesn't happen all the time. And they all stayed.
Yeah, so that was nice. I mean, hopefully they've learned better instincts since then. When you get the chance to get out of class, get out of class. But I appreciated it in the moment, and I appreciate it now. And the case we're going to talk about, which is a case that they had looked into quite a bit, is the case of Pervis Payne. As we said in the beginning, Pervis Payne is accused of double murder, a really heinous murder. He's been in prison for quite some time. This is another case that's going to take us back to the 1980s, I believe. And this is one that has attracted a lot of attention from the Innocence Project, various organizations in Tennessee who look into convictions and look for wrongful convictions. And like we always do, we're going to lay this one out for you. We're going to start with the case that the prosecution presented, what the defense was, and the outcome. Obviously, if it's a wrongful conviction, spoiler alert, he will be convicted at the end. We're going to give you that evidence. We're going to walk through it. And then we are going to do something a little different from what we normally do. We're going to present to you the argument that has been made in the clemency petition by Payne's current defense team. And we'll obviously give you our opinion at the end about which way we lean. But we want this to be sort of, once again, an opportunity for you to hear the two sides of this case and make your own decision. I don't think this is one that will take us 8 or 9 episodes like some of our cases do, but we'll be here for a couple episodes, and it's a case that is worth the time. So with that, thank you again to all the great kids who helped us with this case, but let's dive into the story. So this is the story of Pervis Payne and Charisse Christopher. Now, it is a tragedy in more ways than one. The two seemingly unconnected individuals would become inextricably linked in 1987 when Charisse was murdered and Payne was accused of the crime. But there's more to the story than what meets the eye. Many believe that Pervis is sitting in prison for a murder he didn't commit. But if he didn't do it, who did?
Charisse Christopher was born in Millington, Tennessee, where she grew up as one of 8 children. She had a happy childhood, but her life took a turn when she married Kenneth Christopher at the age of 24. Their marriage, unfortunately, was not a happy one, and it wasn't long before Kenneth started physically abusing Charisse. Despite the obvious issues in their marriage, the couple went on to have their first child together, a baby boy named Nicholas. Not long after, Charisse became pregnant with their second child, but by this point, Charisse couldn't handle the physical, mental, and emotional abuse anymore, and she divorced Kenneth, returning to her hometown of Millington, Tennessee with her 2 young boys.
Now, Charisse and her children moved into the Hiawassee apartments with her sister Angie, who was also separated from her husband. The apartment complex had only 4 units, 2 upstairs and 2 downstairs. Charisse and Angie occupied one of the upstairs units. The sisters continued living together for a time, but ultimately Angie and her husband worked things out, and she moved back home, leaving Charisse and the kids at the Hiawassee apartments by themselves.
So we've talked a lot about Charisse so far, but you know that Charisse's story is going to be inextricably tied with Pervis Payne. So where does Pervis come into Charisse's life? Pervis Payne grew up in Tipton County, Tennessee, with his mom, dad, and 2 sisters. They were a tight-knit family, and Pervis enjoyed nothing more than making his family laugh. But life was not without its struggles for Pervis. He had an intellectual disability that caused him to struggle both at school and with everyday tasks. And this is something that is going to be pushed heavily by his defense counsel at trial about his intellectual disability. Reading, math, and spelling were a challenge, as well as things like cooking and laundry. Not making fun of Pervis, but I know a lot of people who have trouble with cooking and laundry. It has nothing to do with IQ. And this is actually going to come in later as we kind of discuss just how intellectually disabled Pervis may have been and if it affected daily chores or if it affected his ability to know right from wrong.
And you may think that seems like a silly thing. Why is he even bringing that up? But that's actually part of the test. When you get into intellectual disability, when it comes to punishments and various other things, you don't just look at IQ. In fact, the courts have specifically said you don't just look at IQ. You have to judge all of these things like how well you can carry out basic daily functions. And those are things that the courts consider when they consider whether or not any potential intellectual disability actually has a mitigating effect on any crime you're accused of committed.
So despite his efforts, Pervis tried to graduate high school, but he was unable to do so. He also struggled to follow complex instructions, making it difficult to obtain and hold a job. And he worked at a local Pizza Hut after high school, helped out at his father's church, as well as his father's painting business. So he kind of held, odd and end jobs to make ends meet. On June 27th, 1987, Pervis was at the apartment building of his girlfriend Bobby Thomas in Millington, Tennessee, where he claims to have stumbled across a scene that would change the course of his life forever: the murder of Charisse Christopher and her daughter, Lacey. Previously, I said that Charisse had 2 sons. She had a daughter and a son.
So this is June 27th, 1987. That's where we're going to jump in to the timeline. So let's back up to before 3 p.m. that day. So Pervis Payne, he stops by the Hiawassee apartments several times that day to see if his girlfriend, Bobby Thomas, had returned home. Bobby had been to Arkansas visiting her mother, but she was set to return on that day, and she and Payne had plans to spend the weekend together. But she didn't have a solid time when she would be home. And this being 1987, once again, no cell phones. And before that random person on Facebook corrects me, there's no way Pervis Payne had a cell phone. Even if some rich guy in Manhattan was walking around with a brick, Pervis Payne didn't have a cell phone, and there was no way that his girlfriend was going to be able to get in touch with him. So what he's doing is he's just going to the apartment, seeing if she's there, leaving, coming back a little bit later, see if she's there, she's not. So he makes several of these trips back and forth, but each time he goes, she's not there. So on the last of these trips, or actually I guess the second to last of these trips, he actually leaves his overnight bag and 3 cans of Colt 45 liquor in the sort of hallway, the open hallway, just outside of her door. He doesn't have a key to her apartment. He can't go inside. I guess he's tired of carrying this stuff around, so he just leaves it outside. And this is sometime prior to 3 o'clock.
So now this brings us to 3:10 p.m. Nancy Wilson, resident manager and tenant of the downstairs unit right below Charisse Christopher, said that she heard screaming, yelling, and running in the Christopher apartment above her. And she heard a door banging open and shut, and Charisse screaming, "Get out, get out." She said it wasn't as though she was telling the intruder to get out. It was more like she was telling her children to get out. Nancy left her apartment to investigate and started towards the Christopher apartment to see what was the matter. But what she heard had been so disturbing that she thought better of it and instead returned to her unit, where she called the police instead of doing the investigating herself.
Which is smart. It was definitely the right thing to do. So at 3:23, and this is another one of those cases where we're depending a little bit on people to give us the times, but every now and then we have a solid time, and this is one of those instances. At 3:23, dispatch receives her phone call, Nancy Wilson's phone call, and immediately sends a squad car to the apartment building. So Nancy hangs up the call. Now at this point, the police are on their way. She goes to the bathroom and she noticed that the screaming upstairs has stopped, but she can now hear someone in the bathroom above her, and it sounded like they were washing up. So she hears someone moving around upstairs, she hears footsteps, she hears a door slam, and then she hears someone running down the stairs. Now, meanwhile, according to Pervis, he has now returned to the Hiawassee apartment complex, and he's waiting outside, and he sees a man run past him, and as he's running past him, he drops some coins and papers. Unclear why, unclear whatever happened to these coins and papers. Pervis bends down, he picks them up, he goes into the apartment, and he notices that the door to the unit across from his girlfriend's was open. Now, this obviously is in contradiction to what we hear from Nancy. She hears a door slam. Now, it's possible the door slams. For whatever reason, it doesn't close, it doesn't lock, and it swings back open. In any event, Pervis says he sees this door open, and not only does he see the door open, but he hears the sound of a baby crying. So he does what you might expect in that situation. He goes into the unit to investigate.
Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. Greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
And it was then that Pervis was met with what he described as, quote, the worst thing he'd ever seen in his life. There was blood everywhere, and Charisse Christopher and her 2 children were lying bloodied on the kitchen floor, all having been stabbed multiple times. According to Payne's later testimony, Charisse even had the knife in her throat still when he discovered the scene, and she had her hand on the knife as if she was trying to pull it out herself. And her mouth was just moving, but he said that words had faded away. So she was like in this trance, clearly on her way, to death, with this hand clutching this knife that's still sticking out of her neck as her words are trying to get out of her mouth, but she can only muster so much energy to move her mouth, but no words come out. Pervis said that he was completely shocked. He did not know what to do. And so he went up to Charisse and removed the knife from her throat and ran outside to try and find help.
Now, this story is going to evolve a little bit over time because there's going to be evidence in this apartment that can't really be explained away if this is the story. But initially, this is what he says. He grabs the knife, he pulls it out, doesn't really know what to do. He runs outside to try and find help. I told this story at some point about how we met with some kids, and I asked them if any of them had ever seen Murder, She Wrote, and they all looked at me like I was a crazy person. And so I had to explain.
They had no idea who. Is it Angela Lansbury?
Angela Lansbury, absolutely.
Who is the teapot in Mrs.
She was the teapot
in Beauty and the Beast. I mean, this is like our childhood. And they were like, Murder, She What? And I was like, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear.
She was the mayor in the most recent animated Grinch with Benedict Cumberbatch.
Is that right?
That was her last
Way to
role.
go, Angie.
Yep. I know that because my kids love that movie. So
let me just say, this was the only time that these students' age showed. Otherwise, their maturity was shown through.
Yeah, it was great. Not that you have to have watched Murder, She Wrote to be mature, but nevertheless, for those of you out there, all you youngins out there, there used to be all these great shows on television. I feel like they don't make shows like this anymore. Like you have CSI and all that stuff, but these great sort of whodunit, solve it in one episode, master detective type shows, they just don't have them anymore. So whether it was
these are things that we can't accomplish in one episode.
Exactly. Whether it was Matlock or Murder, She Wrote or Perry Mason,
even MacGyver, right?
Even MacGyver.
He got out of any situation in one episode.
Magnum P.I. Another great show. Love that show. Love Magnum P.I. Old Magnum P.I., not new Magnum P.I. But anyways, invariably in these shows, what would happen is our hero, whether it's Angela Lansbury. Let's just go with Angela Lansbury. So she would be somewhere where some murder would happen, and some obviously innocent person would be the one to find the body. And what is the first thing they do? They would always walk up and pick up the knife. Always. Invariably, in every single episode. And then what always happened immediately after the picking up of the knife? The police walked in. And so there they are, standing over somebody that they had reason to kill, holding the murder weapon. They're obviously.
I mean, to be fair, this is exactly the cliffhanger of a more recent. This is not just the old time. I know we're talking about the 80s, a glorious age, but Only Murders in the Building, right? What season 2 ends
there
with
you go. Wait, no,
Selena Gomez.
That was season 1 because I'm in the middle of season 2
1.
right now.
Okay, sorry. Season 1 ends with a cliffhanger, which is that someone is over a bloodied body and knife or stabbing device.
Exactly.
And they claim they didn't do it.
So this is a really, really bad fact for Pervis Payne. Not only does he pick up the knife, but he actually removes it from Charisse's throat. This is one of many instances where Pervis's intellectual disability is going to come in from his defense, particularly his new defense, to try and explain some of the things he does. That, yes, you out there in the world would know not to pick up the knife, and you would never, under any circumstances, remove the knife from a person's throat. I mean, it's just hard to even imagine doing that. But Pervis, you can't think about the things he does through your own lens. You have to think about it through his.
And part of the reason you don't, whether it's completely medically true or not, is we've watched enough shows and we've heard enough, is that you don't know how the knife is holding things in place. And so if were you to remove it, especially in a place where there's a lot of blood vessels, it could actually cause the person to bleed out. And if the knife had been left in or removed by a medical professional, they could prevent the bleeding out. That's kind of the idea behind it. And why most people would be advised on a 911 call, for example, not to remove a device that is already in the body.
Now, he does this. He runs out to find help. But when he exits the apartment unit, he sees a police car and he panics. Once again, I just want to put everybody in the right frame of mind here. He is intellectually disabled. It's 1987. It's rural Tennessee. There are racial issues then, as now, probably worse then than they are now. He is a black man. Seeing the police is not necessarily the thing that makes him think, oh, great, help has arrived. Also, there's another problem. He is now covered in blood, and he's leaving the scene of a murder, and he's afraid of what the police might think. Now, the officer Payne sees is Officer C.E. Owen of the Millington PD. He is the first to arrive on the scene after Nancy's call. Now, the disturbance call was assigned to 2 other officers, Officers Beck and Brawell, but he was only 2 minutes away from the apartment building when he heard the call come in and decided to go by and see if they needed any backup. This is important because from the moment Nancy calls and dispatches somebody, only a couple minutes pass. And be thinking about that as we go through the facts of this case. Everything that had to happen in those 2 minutes, according to Pervis. He gets out of his cruiser and he begins walking towards the front entrance. When he's doing so, he can see through a large picture window that, quote, a black man was standing on the second floor landing of the stairwell. So the officer then witnessed the man bend over to pick up an object before coming down the stairs and exiting the front door of the building. He was carrying an overnight bag and a pair of sneakers, and he was covered in blood.
So as you'd expect, Officer Owen approached this man and asked, "How are you doing?" And at this point, Pervis responded, "I'm the complainant." Owen then asked, "What's going on up there?" And at this point, Pervis struck Officer Owen with the overnight bag, dropped his tennis shoes, and started running west on Biloxi Street, away from the apartment complex. And because he had just struck an officer, and clearly there had been some sort of disturbance at this apartment building, and now you have someone running away from the scene of a potential disturbance, maybe worse, Officer Owen pursues Pervis, but Pervis is fast and he outdistances him and he disappears into another apartment complex. Now, at this point, Officer Owen recognizes things are not going great. So he radios for backup, and Officer Boyd responds. He explained what happened with Pervis before directing the officer's attention back to the apartment Pervis had fled from. Now, Charisse Christopher's unit was locked, but Nancy Wilson, who had made that call, had a master key and was able to let the officers in. And it was obvious immediately that something was very wrong. The officers walked into Charisse's apartment and there was blood everywhere. It was covering the walls, the floors. It was just a disastrous scene. And that's when they saw Charisse and her 2 young children laying on the floor of the kitchen, completely covered in blood.
Now, one thing I don't want you to miss in the horror of this scene is what they came upon: a locked and closed door. Recall, what did Nancy say she heard when she heard the man run out? She heard the door slam. And we speculated maybe the door bounced open or whatever, and that's what she's hearing. Well, the problem is, by this point, the door is closed and locked. I don't recall Pervis saying that he closed the door. I'm not sure why he would close the door. But this is more consistent with what Nancy said than it is with what Pervis said. And this brings you back to sort of this timeline. Remember, there's only a couple minutes here. So really, what you have to think happened is Nancy, she hears the screaming, she calls the police. While she's on the phone with the police, the murderer leaves, doesn't slam the door. Then Pervis is the one who shows up. He's the one she hears in the bathroom washing up, which, as I said, isn't going to be consistent with the story he told. And then he's the one who leaves and slams the door. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of little details here that are important for exactly what happened.
And you would also think the person who was responsible for this gruesome murder would have an interest in closing the door and locking the door. Because remember, this is a very small apartment building. There's only 4 units, only 2 upstairs. And one of the people, if you were paying attention to these apartments at all, whether you're Pervis or not, may know that the only other apartment on the 2nd floor has an occupant who is not in town. So Charisse's apartment may go unnoticed. If someone comes upon it, why would anyone try a locked door? Most people lock their doors when they're home. And so if you come upon a locked door, you hear no sounds in there because the people inside are dead, then it's very possible that this murder, this, double, potential triple murder, could go undetected for a while. So if you are the perpetrator, you can see why the perpetrator would want the door not only closed, but locked. It was just really by chance that Nancy overheard what was going on, called the police, and happened to be like the tenant manager who had a master key and was able to get the officers in instead of having them break down the door. We've had other cases, remember, where the police show up, try a locked door, leave, when they were like, well, gee, everything must be okay since the door isn't opening. And of course, that ended up also in a gruesome murder. That was all avoided here. We immediately get in and see what was happening. By luck that Nancy was home kind of in the middle of the day and had a key.
And I don't want to act like this is the most definitive piece of evidence in the case, but there's really no reason for Payne to close that door. It doesn't fit with anything. It doesn't fit with him running out for help. It just doesn't make sense why he would close the door if he's doing what he says he's doing, which is running outside to find help. Why close the door behind him?
So back to this scene that the officers walk in on, this bloody, gruesome scene with Charisse and her 2 children lying in just pools of blood. And as devastating as this is, it doesn't matter how many gruesome scenes you've walked into, nothing prepares you for seeing children in this state. And Officer Boyd all of a sudden discovered that 3-year-old Nicholas was actually still breathing, so he quickly called for an ambulance. The medic ambulance arrived shortly thereafter and transported Nicholas to Le Bonheur Children's Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. And they also confirmed, unfortunately, that both 28-year-old Charisse and 2-year-old Lacey were dead.
And the violence of this attack, as we're going to continue to get into, is striking. And it makes you wonder about the attack. And frankly, it makes you wonder whether or not it would be Pervis who did this. Because I'm sure what all of you are thinking is, why do you stab the kids? But he didn't just stab them. So Nicholas Christopher, he's on the operating table from 6 p.m. to 1 a.m. with extensive injuries, multiple lacerations, several stab wounds that had gone completely through his body from front to back.
And again, the question, as you're hearing about the extent of these injuries, think about the ages of these children. 3 and 2. 3 and 2-year-old children cannot overpower a grown person. They can do very little. They can hardly run away from their mother to go get help. Very few know how to call 911. There weren't cell phones around. There wasn't FaceTime. Navigating a locked door, for example, is very difficult for a 3 or a 2-year-old. In terms of obstacles that you encounter, say this was a robbery gone wrong, 3 and a 2-year-old are typically not high on the list of impediments to whatever you're seeking to do, whether it's rob or to kill a grown woman. So to neutralize young toddlers is relatively simple without having to go to the extent of what you're about to hear about. And this matters because we've talked about how violent crimes, especially when it's something like overkill, usually leads law enforcement to think about this being a personal crime. Someone who knows the person, has some emotion tied to kind of the actions that they're doing, rather than just accomplishing a goal of saying, neutralizing the noise or a potential alert to law enforcement that they're doing something that they shouldn't.
So this initial 7-hour surgery is followed by 2 others, but ultimately, thankfully, Nicholas did survive the attack. Later that same day, Pervis was located and arrested at the townhouse of his former girlfriend, Sharon Nathaniel. He was hiding in the attic when officers arrived and was wearing nothing but dark pants. Payne said to officers, "Man, I ain't killed no woman," as he was being arrested. Officer Beck claimed at the time of the arrest that Payne had, quote, "a wild look about him. His pupils were contracted. He was foaming at the mouth, saliva. He appeared to be very nervous. He was breathing real rapid," which could be because he killed somebody, could be because he realizes he's in a lot of trouble because of this whole situation. Now, the police also found a pony pack with white residue in it on his person, so something typically one would see that would contain cocaine, as well as a syringe wrapper and an orange cap from a hypodermic syringe, which led the police to believe that he was high on something at the time. Now, Payne had blood on his pants, on his watch, and on his body. He also had 3 or 4 scratches across his chest. Officers were able to recover his overnight bag in a nearby dumpster, which contained a bloody white shirt. The same bloody white shirt that Officer Owen had seen him wearing at the scene, as well as a blue shirt and several other shirts.
So that was June of 1987. Now let's fast forward to September 1st of 1987. So just a couple months later, Pervis Payne was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault to commit first-degree murder, and his bond was set at $125,000. Now, Pervis pleads not guilty. He asserts his constitutional right to a trial by a jury of his peers, and that's exactly what happens. Just a few months later, on February 10th, 1988, Pervis Payne's trial began. And let's talk about the state's case against him, because you heard the story as the prosecution kind of laid it out. But what exactly is the evidence against Pervis? And some of you may be thinking, if he is so guilty, why would he choose to go to trial? So let's see what the evidence says and if it actually stacks up. So this was what the prosecution brought. Charisse Christopher had sustained 42 knife wounds and 42 defensive wounds on her arms and hands. The medical examiner testified that the 42 knife wounds represented 41 thrusts of the knife, because there was 1 perforated wound to her left side that went through her side. And of all these wounds, there were 13 that were serious enough to have potentially caused death on their own. What this tells you, this is the very definition of overkill, right? If 13 of these wounds were serious enough in places that could have killed her, to have 42 wounds is many, many more stabs than you possibly needed to ensure that she was going to die. And this is also very, very time intensive. We've talked a lot about how long it takes to stab someone 41 times, even if there are 42 knife wounds. Think about the actual action of plunging a knife into a body, which is not easy work, by the way, pulling it out and doing it 40 more times. Let's say you're really speedy and able to do it. And we know that she's fighting, by the way. So at least the first several wounds before she's probably incapacitated, it's not going to be very fast because there's going to be fighting. And she fought literally to her death. That's why she has 42 defensive wounds, right? She was not sitting down and taking it. And in order to do that, there's no way this happened in under a minute. It was much, much longer than that, which is consistent with what the neighbor heard downstairs, where there was a lot of yelling, a lot of banging, a lot of running back and forth before everything went silent. And why this is important to note is that if it is kind of a robbery gone wrong or a hit of some sort, all you need is to kill the person and leave. No need to stick around and stab someone 42 times and then do the same type of damage to 2 other small children. That takes a lot of time, which increases the amount of time you have to spend at the crime scene, which thereby increases the risk of you being caught. So this is a big deal. Says a lot about the perpetrator, says a lot about the crime that has been committed here. Now, the medical examiner went on to say that Charisse likely died within maybe 30 minutes, but she would have been unconscious within a few minutes after the stabbing had finished. This is also interesting because, first of all, I can't imagine being alive for 30 minutes after sustaining 42 knife wounds, 13 of which are serious enough to kill you. But remember what Pervis said when he showed up at the apartment. He said that Charisse was conscious enough to be clutching at the knife that was still sticking out of her throat, and her mouth was moving even though words weren't coming out. That would have to be within a few minutes of her stabbing based on what the medical examiner sees, because if he had arrived much longer after that, it seems that she would have been completely unconscious, unable to mouth anything, probably unable to grasp at the handle of a knife.
Which, in Pervis's defense, is consistent with what had to happen here. I mean, I think you're starting to see, if Pervis didn't do this, then this had to be a bang bang thing. Basically, the last stab wound to her throat, and then the guy leaves, which Pervis says he's coming up steps. He sees the guy come running past him. He goes in, and then there she is, can barely speak, and then I guess she would have been unconscious pretty quickly after that. I don't think there's any way she survived for 30 minutes, though, because I think she was dead by the time the police got there, which was only 30 seconds later. So this is one of those where the medical examiner is giving the, and you can see this where, well, could she have survived 15 minutes of those kind of wounds? Yeah, that's possible. Could she have survived 30 minutes? Probably not much more than 30 minutes. That doesn't mean she survived 30 minutes. It just means with those wounds, that's sort of the outward limitation to how long she could survive. I think in reality, she was gone a couple minutes after this was over.
Okay, so that may already sound like the most devastating medical report already, but it gets worse because the medical examiner also testified that Charisse was menstruating at the time of her death, and they knew this because there was a used tampon found on the floor near her knee. And when they saw that, they, of course, ran a rape kit, which came back positive for acid phosphatase, an enzyme present in semen, indicating that she may have been raped. Oh my gosh. Just a thought on this. If she had been raped, and of course this is exactly how medical reports are read. If you've ever had blood drawn, labs run, they don't say things like, for example, when you're having a baby, if you try to find out, the sex of the baby, they don't actually tell you you're having a girl or you're having a boy. They say something like DNA consistent with that of a male, DNA consistent with that of a female. And they say that because it's all to a medical degree of certainty. So they can't say that this is semen because they don't know that it's semen. But what you test for are the enzymes and the substances that could be present in semen. So what other thing may be causing acid phosphatase in her vaginal cavity? It could be something other than semen, but unlikely in these circumstances. So think about this. If she were raped before she were stabbed, the indication is that she was, because the tampon is so close to her body, is that someone recognized she was menstruating, still wanted to rape her, forcefully pulled out the tampon. Remember, children are still around. We'll talk about the timeline of, who was stabbed first and whatnot. And then to force themselves on her before killing her with 42 stab wounds. I mean, this is incredibly violent, incredibly male dominant. We can say that this is a guy doing it because of the potential presence of semen here. And it's a utter disregard for things that would often turn a lot of guys away, I would say. So this person didn't care. They cared about really inflict whatever they wanted to do. And that amount of pain inflicted on her or her children did not matter in the least.
And if Pervis is telling the truth, then I guess you would have to believe that, in fact, just to make it even worse, the person who did this stabbed her children first, because stabbed her children, raped her, and then stabbed her to death and left the knife in her throat. If what Pervis is saying is true, that would have to be what went down in this case. And when you start to look at the stab wounds to Lacey Christopher, if this case isn't bad enough, it gets even worse. So she had 9 stab wounds to her chest, abdomen, back, and head, one of which cut her aorta and would have been nearly immediately fatal. Now, the knife, remember, the story we're told is knife is sticking out of the mom's throat. Pervis removes the knife, drops it on the ground. Well, the knife was actually found next to Lacey's feet. It was a bloody butcher knife, and it was determined to be the murder weapon. There's a lot of blood in this case, and so the state is going to look at blood. This is before DNA was being used, so this is, as I think we did in the McDonald case, we're going to look at blood typing. So Charisse and Lacey both had type O blood, and Nicholas and Pervis Payne had type A blood. A forensic serologist testified that type O blood was found on Pervis's white shirt, his blue shirt, his tennis shoes, and on the overnight bag. Type A blood was found on the black pants he was wearing when seen by Owen and when arrested. So that means he's not obviously bleeding. He does have these scratches on his chest, but you would think in order for the A blood to get on his pants, he would have had to have been around Nicholas at some point. It's possible that all the O blood came from Charisse. And remember, he speaks about interacting with her. And remember that initial story. He goes in, he sees Charisse, he pulls the knife out, he doesn't know what to do, he runs outside, there are the police, he runs away. Well, the problem with that is at some point, this blood has to come into contact with him from the little boy who was stabbed and survived. Next piece of really bad evidence for Pervis Payne. His baseball cap had a size adjustment strap in the back with a U-shaped opening to accommodate adjustments. You guys have all seen baseball caps before. You know what we're talking about. Well, they found the baseball cap, and it was in the apartment. But it wasn't just anywhere in the apartment. It was actually on Lacey's forearm. Her hand and forearm were sticking through the opening between the adjustment strap and the cap material. So somehow her hand went through that opening and the hat was stuck on her hand. In addition to this, there were 3 Colt 45 beer cans found on a small table in the living room. 2 of them were unopened. 1 was opened but not empty. These had Pervis's fingerprints on them, and as you may recall, he admitted that's one of the things he did, was he dropped off beers before at some point earlier that day. There's also a 4th empty beer can that was on the landing outside the apartment door, and he purchased Colt 45 beer earlier that day and talked about leaving it there. In addition to this, his fingerprints were also found on the telephone and on the counter in the kitchen. So based on this evidence, the prosecution had a theory. And that theory was that Pervis had basically spent the day riding around with a friend of his. The friend's name was Sylvester Robinson. And that both of them were drinking. They were also shooting cocaine. That's why the pony pack, which a pony pack, by the way, is drug lingo for this little pack that holds cocaine. And looking at Playboy magazines. All this will be disputed later on by the defense, by the way. But this is the theory, that they're drinking, they're getting high. Remember, what is Pervis waiting on? He's waiting on his girlfriend to get home. She's been gone for a while. He wants to see her. Gonna go out on a limb and say that probably his intentions with the overnight bag and everything else were not just to hang out and watch Netflix. So they're driving around, doing all this stuff. He goes back to the complex. His girlfriend still hasn't returned. Then he either sees Charisse go in or he hears her, and in some way he knocks on the door. Now, he was a familiar face in the unit. It's not believed that they really knew each other, but they would have seen each other. They would have ran into each other before. So either way, he might have said, hey, can I have some water? He might have said, hey, I'm waiting on my girlfriend. Do you mind if I wait inside? It's hot out here. Any number of things he could have said. He goes inside, he sits down.
And this is really interesting because I think that's a really good point you make right there. There's nothing in the record that indicates they really knew each other or were friends, but we do know that he is dating someone who lives in the only apartment across the hall in this apartment complex from Charisse. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to think that they've seen each other, may not even know each other's names, but there's nothing in the record saying that they hung out, as friends or that he'd ever been in her apartment before.
Right, exactly. But it's June. So it's probably pretty hot. So you could imagine him saying, look, I'm just waiting on my girlfriend. Do you mind if I wait inside with you? He goes inside. He sits on the couch maybe. He drinks one of those beers. At some point, maybe he makes some sexual advances. Things go wrong. Charisse says, no, you need to get out of here. He becomes enraged. He's been drinking. He's been taking drugs. And basically, he goes into a frenzy. He murders her, rapes her, and then murders the children as well. That is the prosecution theory that's put forward.
So there's a lot of really bad evidence against Pervis Payne, but as we've always said, withhold judgment until you hear both sides of the story. And of course, the prosecution gets to go first in trial, but the defense also gets to put up their version of events. So in this kind of case where there's DNA, there's blood evidence, there's eyewitness evidence, there's police evidence, there's running away, there's a lot really against Pervis. And it's not really surprising that he decides to testify in his own defense. And he says that he did not harm any of the Christopher family. He claimed to have seen, quote, a black man descend the inside stairs, race by him, and disappear out the front door of the building as he returned to pick up his bag and beer before proceeding to his friend Sharon Nathaniel's to await the arrival of Bobby Thomas. That's interesting because we know that he stops by his current girlfriend's apartment at least 3 times and has no trouble leaving his bag there. It's not immediately clear why he would decide to come pick up his bag before his girlfriend arrives and to go not just to a friend, but I think an ex-girlfriend's apartment. That's not where he was hanging out that day. He could have been there all day because Sharon apparently wasn't out of town. So why didn't he start there? So you see some holes that are beginning to kind of form here as he's testifying. But nevertheless, this is what he says on the stand. So he's putting himself at the scene at the time of the crime. Because he's not saying he walked in and found Charisse the way she was and her children the way they were. He says that he actually sees someone running down the stairs, and he describes this person as a black man. So someone specific enough that he was able to catch the race of them, the gender of them, and what they did. So if he saw this person run down the stairs, he basically saw the murder just happen. Right? That's the implication. And he goes on to describe this man that he saw running down the stairs. He said the man was wearing a long, white, tropical shirt, so long that the shirt covered his shorts. And he said that this man dropped some change and papers on the stairs as he ran down, but the man just kept running. So Pervis picks up the things this man dropped, and he put it in his pocket before continuing up the stairs to get his overnight bag and beer that he'd left on the second floor landing by his girlfriend's locked door. But he said that when he reached the landing, he heard a baby crying and a call for help coming from the Christopher apartment. This is important because here we have a call for help coming from Charisse. He doesn't say that this is coming from the children. He hears a baby crying, and then he audibly hears, at this point, he doesn't testify that he's seen anything. He hasn't looked inside the door, but he hears a call for help, and he says that is what instigates him to go look into what he's hearing. And upon reaching the landing, turning the corner, hearing the baby cry, hearing this call of distress, he sees that Charisse's door was open. It was ajar. And he said that he yelled into the open door, "I'm coming in," and entered the unit. So in his own words, Payne described the scene he was met with when he opened the door, and I'm going to read it to you verbatim of what he said on the stand. Quote, "I saw the worst thing I ever saw in my life, and like my breath just had took out of me. You know, I didn't know what to do, and I put my hand over my mouth and walked up closer to it, and she was looking at me. She had the knife in her throat with her hand on the knife like she had been trying to get it out, and her mouth was just moving, but words had faded away. And I didn't know what to do. I was about ready to get sick, about ready to vomit. And so I ran closer. I saw a phone on the wall, and I lifted and got the phone on the wall. I said, don't worry. Don't worry. I'm going to get help. Don't worry. And I got ready to grab it, the phone, but I didn't know no number to call. I didn't know nothing. I didn't know nothing about no number, or I just start trying to twist numbers. I didn't know nothing. And she was watching my movement in the kitchen like I had saw her. It had been almost a year off and on in the backyard because her kids had played with Bobby's kids, and I have seen her before. She looked at me like, I know you know? And I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave her. Because she needed help. I was raised up to help, and I had to help her."
So he goes on to describe pulling the knife from Charisse's throat and kneeling on the bloody floor and checking on the two children, which explains why he was covered in blood. You may notice that his testimony covers a lot of the things we've talked about before. It starts to explain some of the evidence. Why does he have the blood on him? Why are his fingerprints on the kitchen table? Why are they on the telephone? Now, one problem with this is the more stuff he adds, the tighter that timeline gets. Because remember, he only has a couple minutes to do all of this, and really less than a couple minutes. So he says he's doing this. He also says that he didn't go in the bathroom to wash up. Remember, that was something that Nancy Wilson said. And this almost had to be him because, once again, there's not enough time for the killer to have gone in the bathroom and washed up and left, and him got there, done all this stuff, and the officer, who's only 2 minutes away, to have arrived when he did. But nevertheless, he says he didn't do that. But he does say he went to the kitchen sink where he would get water to drink, and he did that multiple times because he kept feeling like he might throw up. So he left the unit with the intention of knocking on doors and finding someone to help. But he panics when he sees the police officer standing outside. Now, once again, one thing he doesn't explain is why that door is closed. Now, he knows what it's going to look like at this point, so he runs. Now, his shirt was torn. Now, he is not able to provide an explanation for that, but he did attempt to refute the state's claims that he had scratches on his chest, claiming that they were stretch marks from weightlifting. I don't know, as ripped as I am, I'm not that familiar with stretch marks from weightlifting, so whether they would look like scratches or not, I can't say, but that is what he testifies to.
I might go for something slightly different and be like, I used to be real fat. Then I went to the gym and got ripped, so those are stretch marks. But
let me just say one other thing. So it's a remarkably detailed description of the guy. It's not super detailed, but he does describe him as wearing a Hawaiian shirt that's really long. It goes down past his pants. It's white. But what does he not say? He doesn't say the guy's covered in blood. There's no way someone did this and they don't have blood all over him. Whether it was Pervis, who did have blood all over him, or this guy. So unless it was just a white shirt and he mistook blood for sort of the Hawaiian print, it's a little unusual that he doesn't describe blood being on this individual.
And another interesting thing, of course, we will talk about the race dynamic and the trust or mistrust in police. But if he testifies that the purpose of leaving the unit is to actually go knock on doors, so to engage out other people to seek help for Charisse, the thought, because there's so much blood and she's clearly in such a terrible state, as are her children, that at some point someone would need to be calling the police or an ambulance at the very least. And it seems, based on his testimony, he wanted to do that. He says that he picks up the phone with the intention of calling some numbers and he starts twisting the numbers, right? Think about phones in the 80s. It's those dial phones rather than punch phones. And so the implication is he's trying to call for help, but he says, basically saying, I don't know enough. Like, he's essentially saying, I have this intellectual disability. I didn't know any numbers. I didn't know any numbers to call. So I wanted to call, but could not do it. So instead, I'm leaving the apartment in order to go find help. The implication is for that person to call for help. Yet, the very person he runs into is a police officer. And instead of saying, call an ambulance, or maybe seeking the help of that police officer, remember the original intention was to go seek help from a third person, he runs. Of course, we'll dive more into police and how police may have very different reactions from people than just, say, a next door neighbor. That is interesting if what he's testifying to is he's desperately seeking help for Charisse, and that's all he can think about. And he wants to call someone, picks up the phone, but cannot even remember the number. Yet when the very help he's apparently seeking is there, he runs the other way. And that's certainly not helping Charisse. He doesn't even say, as he's running away, go check on the lady upstairs. So this trial goes on for a week. And at the end of this trial, the jury deliberates, and Pervis Payne is convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder and sentenced to death. This is very serious. Everything comes back as guilty. In other words, the jury bought everything the prosecution presented and none really of what the defense presented. And he gets the ultimate sentence, which is, of course, death. As with all of these death sentence cases, this is not the end. There are going to be appeals. So soon after, in January, Payne filed a petition for post-conviction relief and a petition for writ of error, which included a claim of ineffective assistance of counsel. But in June of that same year, the court denied relief. He doesn't stop there, though, because almost a decade later, 8 years later, in September of 2006, Payne filed a motion to compel testing of evidence under the Post-Conviction DNA Analysis Act of 2001. Remember, we've talked about this where when there's like development of new technologies or there's newly discovered evidence, you can try and compel the testing of evidence. We've seen this recently in the West Memphis 3 case. And also, the post-conviction court denied this motion, and the Tennessee Supreme Court affirmed the denial on appeal. So despite the second attempt for some post-conviction relief, Payne is denied. There's not going to be further testing of any evidence. Remember what the standard is. You have to show that testing of this DNA is going to likely lead to the case against you. And you heard the case against him. It's unclear how additional testing would somehow draw doubt into the kind of mountain of evidence that the prosecution brought against him.
So at this point, it turns to saving his life. And the obvious path there is going to be his intellectual disability. So in 2012, Payne files a motion to reopen his post-conviction proceedings and to allege intellectual disability, which had been more and more recognized by the courts as a reason not to execute someone in the years since he had been convicted. But later in that year, the Tennessee Supreme Court issued its opinion in which it rejected this claim. He amended his petition, but in May of 2013, the trial court entered another order denying relief. He appealed that. That was denied as well. And this is what you see in these death penalty cases. And people always wonder, why do they take so long? It's because you have lots of post-conviction proceedings that are being filed for one reason or another. Now, in 2019, the defense discovers physical evidence that it claimed had been withheld from them for 30 years. According to the defense, prosecutors failed to, quote, disclose that a bloody comforter, sheets, and a pillow were found in the apartment and never tested. The bedding had never been included in any list of evidence in the case, and its existence was not known to the defense until 2019, when an assistant federal defender obtained a court order to review the evidence. One of 2 things happened here. This was in an evidence bag labeled bedding, bloody bedding, essentially. And it either they just missed it because it was news to the prosecution as well, or possibly was not actually from Pervis Payne's case. There was some sort of mix-up in the evidence room where it wasn't entirely clear where one case ended and another case began, which wasn't great, but this is 30 years later. So as we've said before, you're storing all this evidence. stuff like this happens. What's interesting about this is, of course, it's described as a Brady violation. Unclear why it would be, because it's just some more bloody stuff, unless it has, some DNA from an unknown third party, some blood from an unknown third party. It's probably not going to be that helpful to the defense, but nevertheless, they're pointing out, hey, we never saw this, so that could be a reason to have some further action in this case.
So now we're several decades removed from the original conviction and the original crime, and that brings us to November 4th, 2020. Pervis's case has now gotten some attention from people who are questioning a lot of things about the judicial system during this time, about race dynamics, and the Tennessee Legislative Black Caucus introduced a bill that was inspired by Pervis Payne's case. This bill would create a procedural mechanism for death row prisoners, like Pervis, to present their intellectual disability claims in the Tennessee courts. So basically, Pervis is kind of out of luck in terms of post-conviction avenues, post-conviction relief. And so what the legislature is trying to do is to create a new avenue for him to present another way to change the outcome of his case. And in this case, it would be specifically about intellectual disability. In April of 2021, both houses of the legislature passed the bill, which was signed into law by Governor Lee the following day. I'll say, this is a very smart bill, even though it's not like, let's get Pervis Payne out of jail bill. Essentially, it does give him another avenue to make arguments, and it's a politically completely salient, bill, right? Who's gonna be against trying to keep someone who is intellectually disabled from presenting the case that they shouldn't be on death row because of their intellectual disability? You can see how all sides of the political aisle, the governor, can all get behind something like this. This is like smart politicking, by the way, by picking kind of an issue that everyone can get behind. And in principle, yeah, I'm for this. I don't want anyone who has an intellectual disability who may not have the intellectual ability to recognize what they're doing to be put to death. We have the Constitution about this. So Pervis is now in luck because under this new law, Payne's attorneys are able to file a petition in Shelby County Criminal Court that as a person with an intellectual disability, he should be barred from execution. And the petition stated, quote, Pervis Payne is indisputably intellectually disabled. Mr. Payne meets all three Atkins requirements. Atkins, by the way, I don't know if we've done a legal briefs on it, but it's a Supreme Court case kind of laying out intellectual disability standards. We'll talk more about that later, but that's what Atkins is talking about, as well as those of the Tennessee statute. He has significantly sub-average intellectual functioning, significant adaptive deficits in each domain, and his disability manifested prior to age 18. End of quote. By the way, all of those things are specific things within the law that the courts are looking for. It's not just a simple IQ test, because if you have low IQ, but you're able to graduate from high school, you're able to do laundry, cook, live life normally, just like can't hold high-level philosophical conversations, that doesn't really count as an intellectual disability for purposes of criminal culpability. But all the things they list here are things the courts look at because it's really more of an art than a science. It is not a cold, hard number. Like you hit this number and boom, you're off death row. It's something much more nuanced and complex than that. And so Payne's IQ has been found. So IQ does factor into it, though it's not the only factor. And of course, if he's going to make an intellectual disability claim, his IQ has to be tested. And he's been tested several times. Those of you who've been tested for IQ know that, again, it's a number that kind of varies along a spectrum, and you may get different numbers each time you're tested. But at its very highest, he's been found to be at a 78, which technically puts him on the borderline of intellectual ability that courts consider for death penalty purposes. 70 is really considered a benchmark, though it's not a hard line. But when you're talking about intellectual disability, the cases are typically like the person has something in the 60s, and their attorneys are arguing that they're falling below that measure of 70 for intellectual capability to be able to be on death row. So he's not at the 70 mark. He's a little bit above it. He's not greatly above it. And so this is why intellectual disability is kind of debated within this case.
Yeah, and that's why you look at all that other stuff as well, because he's been tested lower than that. He's been tested in the 60s, but all this testing happened after he was convicted. One can imagine if you ever want to see malingering, the time when you would see malingering is when you're on death row and you're trying to get off death row, and it's really important that you do poorly on an IQ test. So you could imagine it's pretty hard to test IQ accurately. So you do a lot of, you look at what a person's life was like before they were convicted. In any event, he is eventually successful. On November 23rd, 2021, Shelby County Judge Paula Scahan vacates Payne's death sentence after more than 3 decades on death row. She wrote an order that stated that Payne's petition, quote, is supported by 2 expert opinions, concluding that petitioner is intellectually disabled pursuant to Tennessee law, as well as the decisions of the United States Supreme Court. On January 31st, 2022, Pervis Payne was resentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences, which, and I always remind people of this, all the people who are against the death penalty, and always just assume that if you don't get the death penalty, well, you're going to get life without parole. No, that's not what happens. And in fact, he will be eligible for parole in 2027, so just in 3 years, after having served 39 years, which, if he's guilty of this crime, seems like not enough time. But nevertheless, if he's not guilty, obviously that would be way too much. So that is where we stand today. He is looking at parole in 3 years, but his defense has not stopped. And the latest effort has been to convince Tennessee to not only release Pervis Payne, but actually to exonerate him. So there is a petition for clemency and for release. And what we're going to do next time, we're going to go through that. I mean, obviously, right now, it doesn't look good for Pervis. I mean, the evidence is really bad. The timeline is really tight. But there is some more stuff that came up both in the years since Pervis Payne was convicted and also at the time, which pushes towards the other direction. Pretty much everything we've told you right now pushes towards he's guilty. In the next episode, we plan on spending as much time going through this clemency petition and helping you understand why some people think that Pervis Payne is innocent and should be exonerated of this crime. And then we will let you guys decide, as we always do.
And in case some of you are wondering, because we've talked a little bit about IQ scores here, we said that at his highest, Pervis scored a 78. Most people, like when you have that bell curve, the bulk of the bell, people typically score between 85 and 115, with the average being about 100. 100 IQ is like the average. Some people will be above it, some people will be below it. But the bell curve statistic is interesting because the low end of kind of where most people fall is about 7 points higher than where Pervis is. And so, of course, we're all looking at points in time that can be shifted over time. If he's in fact in the low 60s, that's much further off. But that may give you an idea of where the average person will score and maybe where you score as well. And then you'll have the Mensa people who are like, stratospheric.
Like Alice.
Yeah, right. I'm definitely not Mensa. Do you notice all these Mensa kids are like 6, 7 years old? I'm like, really? I don't buy that. Anyways, so this is all very interesting because obviously we're talking about this case because Pervis's case has captured the attention so much so of the public that a law in Tennessee was passed really with him as inspiration. And whether he is actually innocent of the crime or not, this law now exists for other people on death row to take advantage of. So, this is very interesting in terms of how you use advocacy and what decades of hindsight may or may not shed on the interactions that someone may have with the police or in kind of a point in time that we may now think is historical.
And one thing that we learned in the chat is that Pervis Payne's case actually did become significant in the Supreme Court because it is one of the cases that allowed for victim impact statements, which was not something, I think we've talked about that before, how that was not always something that you could do, but it is allowed now. And in fact, it's very common, but it wasn't always so.
You can imagine why his case would be one for it. I mean, this was truly truly a gruesome, whenever kids are involved, it always makes my stomach turn. But this was an instance of overkill and probably unnecessary kill when it comes to the 2 and 3-year-old attempts at trying to kill both of them. So you can see why victim impact statements, we always say, good facts make good law, bad facts make bad law. And in this particular situation, you can see how the victims here have truly suffered a lot, and their voices, it's a very sympathetic position to be in, to want to represent, a young child who has lost their life, a young child who was in, 10 hours of surgeries to save his life, now without his entire nuclear family. These are devastating points that previously really would have had no place in a court, but now they do in Tennessee.
Okay, so like I said, we're going to do sort of more of the pro-Pervis approach next week, but we do want to hear what you guys think. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Tell your friends. Go out and tell your friends about the podcast. If there's one thing every podcaster knows, it's that advertising is useless, and the only way that a podcast grows is when people tell their friends. Because frankly, who are you going to listen to? Some voice on the radio or on some other podcast telling you to listen to something, or are you going to listen to your friends? So go tell your friends, go tell your family. Everybody go out there, convert one person to the prosecutors. We'll see. It's just how far we can go. Thank you to all of you who are patrons and all of you who joined us tonight for this recording. Alice, do you want to answer a question before we sign off?
Please. When we have child murders, I really need something else before we end the recording.
As we've noted before, if you leave a 5-star review, you can have a question answered if you leave a question behind. Or if you've left a 5-star review before, edit it, add the question. We will answer that one as well. Okay, let's see. Okay, this person says, I'm going to leave this all to you, Alice. This is from Andrea. Andrea wants to know, what advice do you have for new parents on balancing parenting, work, family, and all of life? Go for it, Alice.
You can answer this too, because it is the $1 million question. I think the real answer is there's no real balance, right? There are some things that you just have to sacrifice and do less of at certain times, but it's not all forever and it's not all the time. Some days I'm a really good parent, and some days I'm a really good lawyer, but not the greatest parent. And I guess the balance is knowing when to give and take. But I think if you recognize it less as of a balance and more as a sacrifice, it really is a finite amount of time you have in one day and energy. And you have to kind of make wise choices with how you spend those times. But I do not claim to know how to properly balance, except I cut out all the fat in my life, right? Not physically fat because I eat a lot of chocolate, but I don't kind of waste time the way I used to. There's very little time for me to kind of just twiddle away, and I try to be purposeful about all the time in my day so that I can maximize the time I do things like this podcast and spend time with my kids and be able to drop things in a moment, to have the luxury to drop things in a moment if they really need me for something, like to show up at a school event. But I would not ever want to call it a balance because I don't think it's a balance.
Yeah, I think this balancing thing is a load of bull, and people need to stop talking about it. It's designed to make you feel bad. It's put out there by influencers who make a lot of money releasing TikToks and Instagram videos about how they've got it all perfect and look at my perfect life and how I balance everything. It's great. Nobody balances anything. It's just you're doing the best you can. And I guess, my piece of advice would be don't beat yourself up when you don't balance it. When you wish you could do one thing and you end up doing another. I mean, the number of times my wife and I look around our house and like, man, what a mess. We need to clean this place up. When the kids take a nap, we're going to clean the place up. And then the kids take a nap, and what do? We take a nap because we need a nap. And like, is that a failure? Are we not balancing well enough? I mean, I don't know. You just have to struggle through. And look, your priorities are going to be your kids. It's going to be the things that matter to you. Some stuff's going to fall away. It just naturally will. Try and work in time for yourself. I mean, try and do that stuff, but don't beat yourself up because you're not the perfect balance of work and life and children and, yoga or whatever. It's just never going to be like that.
And I'm not the one who came up with it. I'm sure someone can quote me, the author who said this, but like life is, at least in this stage of life, it's like a 3-legged stool, right? There's family, there's professional life, whatever work is, and there's health. Yeah, there's a stool. And then there's health. And at this stage in life, it's impossible to do all three well. You can probably do up to 2 and sometimes only 1, but you can never do all 3. And it's really true. Like the times that I get to exercise all the time, I'm like, man, I'm just really not working as much, or work is quiet. And I'm like no longer in trial and I can actually go work out. Then things get busy. It's like, I don't even know what the inside of a gym looks like. That has been so true for me. And it's helpful for me to know that like, there's more things than can ever be, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5, whatever you have in your life. It's impossible at this stage in life, I think every stage in life, to be excelling in all of them. That's okay. But different things will be higher at different times.
Yeah. So you're doing great. That's my
you are
that's
doing
my final
great.
comment.
There you go.
Okay. Well, we've already gone long, so I'm gonna leave it at that. But thank you so much for the question. Great question as always. That's all we have for today. But we will be back next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Now we go live, so you stop talking about all of our fans.
Whatever. I love our fans.
Yeah.
This
you notice
tab,
that because I'm the bigger person.
What?
Because I'm the bigger person.
What
I took
happened?
out one of my dashes, even though I think 1 dash is inferior to 2 dashes.
Okay,
I'm the bigger
can I
person,
confess something to you?
I took it out.
Can I confess something to you?
Sure.
I agree with you, 2 dashes is proper, but I wasn't going to change out of principle.
See, that tells you who's the bigger person.
Says the person with the Clue Award back there.
There's something.
Oh my gosh, y'all. Y'all, this is just too good. Because here's the thing, the dash could act as 2 purposes. It could simply be like a space. When I was doing it, it wasn't like, you know how sometimes it's just in parentheses. That's how we do it for work, in parentheses, like who you are. But anyway,
Maybe more of a long pause. Like,
or a long pause.
The prosecutor.
The prosecutor.
Yeah.